Our guest today is Kim Daniels, and she will discuss the Vatican's role in world affairs under the first American Pope, Robert Prevost of Chicago, as he was once known, and is now, as forever will be known as Pope Leo XIV. What role, what influence does any pope have on war and peace, and on the policies of governments such as the United States? What role will this pope have on issues such as immigration in the US and other places, and the deportation of undocumented migrants, on the wars in Gaza, the war in Ukraine? Kim Daniels directs the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University and is an adjunct professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies there. She has served as spokesperson for the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and as an advisor on how to articulate positions on a wide range of issues where church teachings intersect with matters of public concern. She has been a member of leading Vatican bodies in the field of communications. She is a graduate of Princeton and the University of Chicago Law School. So, how will the new Pope, the Pope from Chicago, relate to the world, Kim? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roy, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Maybe I'll start with a personal story of where I was on May 8th, 2025, a little over 3 months ago. Of course, that's the day that Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, was elected. And I was in Rome. I had been in Rome for about a week before that, preparing for this. I was doing media for CNN and PBS, NBC, MSNBC, a number of different outlets, talking about what might happen at the conclave, not in a predictive way, but just to give it some context, and really there to offer a certain kind of perspective as someone who had been involved, as Roy mentioned, in different roles at the Vatican and here in the United States in the Catholic Church as well. So I was in the CNN booth in the media platform right at the back of St. Peter's Square. And I had been on for an hour, sort of talking about what we might expect and who we might see. And I frankly did not expect to see white smoke come up from the chimney. And we thought we had wrapped up that hour. Everybody thought it was going to be a longer time until we saw the white smoke. And so I was taking off my microphone and we had closed up shop and gone to a commercial. And I looked down at a monitor. There was a monitor in front of me that was simply trained on the chimney. And all of a sudden, I started seeing white smoke come up. I tapped Chris Lamb, CNN's Vatican correspondent, and I said, "Looks like it's happening." And we shifted gears, and CNN went to smoke mode, right, election mode, and we knew someone was going to walk out on that balcony. A little while later, a little over an hour later, I was sitting there waiting. Chris and I were waiting to see who would come out on the balcony, and frankly, we expected it to be someone else. We at that point, given the speed with the election had happened, we expected it to be one of the names that we had been hearing. And frankly, we had been hopeful and talking about Cardinal Prevost all week long, myself, other colleagues, thinking maybe this could possibly happen. Maybe he might be the one who would break the mold of no American being elected to be our Holy Father in the Catholic Church. And so when it happened so fast, we thought those hopes were dashed. And then, of course, he walked out onto that balcony, and my breath was caught as an American, as someone who is deeply committed Catholic, as someone who's met Cardinal Prevost and understands the respect with which many of my colleagues hold him. I was just so excited and so grateful, frankly, for that election, for the fact that he was the one who walked out on that balcony. The other thing I have to tell you about what it's like to be in St. Peter's Square at that moment is that you really get a sense of the Catholic Church as the major global institution that it is. 1.4 billion Catholics around the world and in country after country across the globe. United States Catholics are only 6% of the world's Catholics, to give you a sense of the global dimensions of our faith and the fact that here in the US, sometimes we look through a narrow lens when in fact, what you see if you work in the church, and in particular, we're in St. Peter's Square at a moment like this, what you see about the faces of of our church who really do come from every corner of the world. So that's what that moment was like. It was really watching history unfold. There was an extraordinary week preceding it and really extraordinary months since then as we learn what it's like to have the first American Pope, to have a new leader of the Catholic Church after the wonderful Pope Francis. Again, as Roy mentioned, I'm the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought in Public Life here at Georgetown. And our work is very much in line with what Pope Leo has stated as some of his priorities. We work to build bridges across political and ideological and religious divides. We work to bring the principles of Catholic social teaching to national and global conversations. We work to help a new generation of young people see their Catholic faith as central to their life and work. And because of that, of course, here at Georgetown, we were very excited about the election of Pope Leo as well. So that's where I came from. That's sort of the seeds of my outlook that I'll offer you here today. Also about 10 years of experience working in various roles in the Vatican, which really has built up some relationships there that I think has given me a little bit of a perspective on this issue. What I'm going to focus on today are three main points. And the first is to answer the question or begin to provide an answer to the question, who is Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV? What experiences have shaped his worldview and what might we expect there? Secondly, how does the Catholic Church engage in international diplomacy? What's changing or what might change, what might stay the same under Pope Leo? And third, a little bit of a perspective, a beginning of a perspective on some of the specific issues that might help define his approach to international relations during his papacy, from Ukraine to Gaza, migration, and frankly, even issues like artificial intelligence, which he has signaled is going to be a focus of his. My point is really straightforward. The idea is that in an era of moral relativism, brutal power politics, I think that Pope Leo XIV represents an indispensable moral voice. He's someone who is uniquely positioned to address both authoritarian aggression abroad and issues of democratic decay here at home with a voice for peace and solidarity and hope. And that's what I'd like to focus on here today. So first, let me talk about Cardinal Prevost and Robert Prevost's journey from the south side of Chicago to that balcony in St. Peter's Square. It kind of reads like a blueprint for global leadership, if you ask me. He was born in Chicago to a family descended from immigrants, one that very much reflects the mosaic of American life, right? Just so many different elements of his background went to shape the Prevost family that lived in that tiny house on the south side of Chicago in a deeply Catholic culture. He had a vocation to the Augustinian order very early in his life, and you've all heard, right, that he went to Augustinian school, that he did high school, and that he ultimately went to Villanova. Here at Georgetown, we've had a Jesuit pope for a while now, Pope Francis, and so now we have likely been insufferable ourselves in focusing on our connection to our Jesuit pope, and Villanova now is very excited to have Pope Leo as a graduate of all things. So that's wonderful. In any event, Pope Leo, as Robert Prevost, he became ultimately prior general of the Augustinians, the leader of the Augustinian order around the world. And again, it's a global religious order. And that meant that he visited communities in over 60 countries, from refugee camps in South Sudan to underground churches in China. He's visited all around the world and really had a global travel experience that I think is unmatched among prior pontiffs. It also wasn't ceremonial travel. He ultimately, as you have likely heard, was a missionary in Peru, spent over 20 years of his life in Peru as a missionary for the Augustinians. And he lived there without running water. He learned indigenous languages. He once walked 3 days through the Amazon to reach a remote community during flooding. This shaped what he might call his missionary heart, and very much again in line with Pope Francis and his background. This idea that the church's role isn't to stay shut up inside church doors, isn't to stay in Rome, but instead is to go out to the peripheries. It's about not staying in the center, but going out to those in need and those who are vulnerable. So this is how he formed. This was his personal formation. And I want to say that during that time in Peru, when he was a real missionary leader, He both grew himself, right, in his outlook on the world and on the outlook on those who live in poverty and the centrality of that to our service as a Catholic Church. But also had leadership in the Latin American Bishops' Conference. He actually ran across Cardinal Bergoglio, who became Pope Francis. And the story goes that they had a rather contentious exchange, and that at the time, Prevost left saying, "Well, that's it. I'll never." When Pope Francis was elected, he said, "Well, I know I'll never be move up to bishop or anything like that, and a good thing too, because we haven't had a good relationship in the past." Well, of course, the story is the opposite. Pope Francis brought him to Rome, and advanced him very quickly because in that difference of opinion that they had, he really respected Cardinal Prevost, who became Cardinal Prevost, Robert Prevost's way of handling it, way of listening, way of standing up for what he believed in, but also engaging in dialogue and understanding when things didn't go his way. So Pope Francis really respected Prevost and ultimately, again, brought him to Rome after his time in Peru to gain experience in Rome, and to learn what it was like to sort of be at the center of our global church. Um, I would say that when we look at how Pope Francis, just building on what shaped Pope Leo, right? What shaped him as Cardinal Prevost, I want to focus a little bit on Pope Francis' view of Cardinal Prevost because he didn't just admire him, he really saw him as a key advisor, and I think it's fair enough to say a possible successor. He made Prevost a cardinal, and he made him something called the prefect for the dicastery for bishops, a very churchy term, but one of the most important roles in the Vatican because it means that Cardinal Prevost was involved in the selection of bishops around the world. Gave him oversight of these episcopal appointments, very important for our church. It meant a few things. It meant that he had an insight into how the church was run. It meant that he engaged with bishops and others from around the world. And it meant that he traveled with Francis. And that was something that's specific to their relationship, that he really wanted to go around the world with Francis and told Francis that this was his way of learning about countries and learning about what bishops might be best suited to serve in those countries. Francis also, towards the end of his life, took the unusual move just weeks before his death of elevating Prevost to a rank of cardinal bishop, again, a very arcane Vatican Catholic terminology. But it was a title that really signaled the esteem in which Francis held Cardinal Prevost. And I think it's important to say that really Francis had a great deal of respect for Prevost, now Pope Leo, and saw him as someone who was going to follow in his footsteps. And I would say for a few reasons, mostly if we had to focus on one, because of his missionary heart, because he had gone to the peripheries. He had not stayed in his comfortable place in the United States, but had gone to Peru and had really lived and out the gospel and lived with those in need and acted in solidarity for peace, for justice. Really something that was important to Francis in who he saw as leaders in the church. I want to say one final word about who Pope Leo is and something that formed him and his place within the Catholic Church. And that's his involvement in something called the Synod on Synodality, which is a major church gathering, Catholic church gathering that happened from 2021 to 2024. It was really a remarkable gathering called by Pope Francis, the largest listening session I think ever held, consultation session ever held in the history of the world by some accounts. Francis said that we want to understand how we can bring the church into our current moment, right? How we can live out the promise of Vatican II, Vatican Council II, the Ecumenical Council in the 1960s that opened the doors, opened the windows of the church to the modern world. How can we really live that out in our moment and make sure that it is coming to fruition today? And he said part of that is making sure that lay people, people who are not priests, who are not religious, do not have a religious vocation, really are listened to, that their voices are heard, that they are understood, and that they have decision-making roles in the church. It's a remarkable achievement to start this process, and it was something I was closely involved in as something called an expert participant, and something that Cardinal Prevost was very, very involved in as well as a participant who was deeply engaged in the work of the Synod on Synodality, as we call it. And why is that important? Well, this 3-year long global consultation, which involved listening to voices at ground level in every country around the world, listening to non-Catholic voices, listening to the voices of people who had left the church, bringing those stories and those lessons up to Rome, um, going through, trying to consolidate and synthesize them, sending them back for further consultation, coming back again to Rome to try to come to some agreement around a common path forward. This 3-year process involved 2 month-long meetings in Rome, at which I was as president as well. Month of October, it's 2 successive years with a break in the middle. And while we were there, it was really a remarkably close session of leaders, a couple hundred leaders from around the world. Again, lay people, women, bishops, ministry leaders, women religious, others coming together to talk around round tables, not sort of in a traditional Catholic way of bishops speaking from on high, but a consultation together about different kinds of paths forward to reform the church, to renew the church, to better live our communion, our participation, and our mission. I mention this and spend so much time on it because it was, number one, another moment where for every participant, we had an idea of what it meant to be part of a global church. You're there with people from around the world every day for an entire month. Secondly, I think it's a way that bishops from around the world got to know Cardinal Prevost, and cardinal electors, people who would be electing him in that conclave, got to know who he was and how effective he was in his quiet way of not dominating conversation, but of listening and learning and being very effective behind the scenes and out in front as well. I think they got to know him. Many, many cardinal electors got to know him there and were impressed with what they saw. And of course, Pope Francis was very close through that process as well. So that synod process was very important, and I think will be very important to Pope Leo's leadership. Now let me talk about the Catholic Church and the Church's role in international affairs. I think that it's important to state at the outset, of course, that we are a global church, as I mentioned, 1.4 billion people around the world, a long history of diplomatic engagement, of course, over centuries. We're the largest charitable organization in the world. And of course, we have a deep history of Catholic social teaching on international relations. I think it's fair enough to say, of course, parenthetically, that that's not going to change, right? That Pope Leo is very much in line with Catholic social teaching around how we act on the world stage. There's very much consistency in our teachings in that regard. I also want to just highlight here that the church is really the largest global network of networks. We have a presence in 195 countries. Those are led by Episcopal conferences in which bishops act and lay people as well act in public life. And we have the Vatican has a unique, I would say, diplomatic arsenal, if you will. Of course, famous statement, right? How many troops does the Pope have? None. But of course, the Pope and the Holy See operates the world's oldest diplomatic service, has nuncios or papal ambassadors in some 183 countries. And this isn't so much, it's soft power in a way, but it's also very smart power. And of course, you can see it in various efforts at diplomatic engagement. I'll point out too, Pope Francis's help in brokering a thaw in relations between the United States and Cuba is one recent example, and another, of course, is in South Sudan, where Pope Francis and papal envoys were really critical in mediating the conflict there. Finally, I'll just say that overall, there are several themes that come through in the Holy See's diplomacy over time. And the first is peace and conflict resolution. The second is our social teachings, right? Solidarity and economic justice. Third, multilateralism and dialogue. And then fourth, I want to say a real priority has always been, and in particular under Pope Francis, issues of migration and refugee protection. as I mentioned, that as one of Pope Francis's priorities. And we know that every pope has a certain kind of priority. If we look back, we can see that Pope Paul VI, really had the diplomacy of dialogue as a focus, if you will. We know that St. John Paul II really engaged and confronted communism, and that was the signature foreign policy effort of his papacy and of those decades. Benedict XVI really was an intellectual engagement engaged on these issues and on how the church should be acting in public life. And then again, Francis was a focus on migration and refugees and a focus on going to the peripheries. So the question that we come to now is, what will Leo's diplomatic vision be shaped by? I think we can take some clues from his first address to the diplomatic corps, which was just shortly after he was elected. And he outlined three foundational principles in that address. The first was peace, which he described as not merely the absence of war, but an active gift demanding we eliminate pride and vindictiveness, that words can wound and kill just like weapons. And I think he really called there for genuine multilateral diplomacy. We heard in his first statement from that balcony in St. Peter's Square him say the word peace multiple times. And that really is a focus of what he will be looking for, and really a focus for every pope on the world stage. The second theme of that address to the diplomatic corps was justice. And he said this, he said, "I chose my name thinking of Pope Leo XIII, who was the author of the first great social encyclical. He said, we cannot remain silent facing inequalities that divide continents and fracture societies. And of course, these inequalities and these injustices are something that fracture peace as well. A central facet of Pope Leo's international engagement will no doubt be a focus on justice and the dignity of every person. And then finally, and I think very interestingly, he focused on truth. And that's not a surprise either, of course. But he said, in an age of ambiguous language and virtual reality, authentic relationships require objective truth. The church must speak bluntly, even when that bluntness might create some initial misunderstanding. And what he's talking about here is talking about the idea that we speak the truth in love, right? So that's a classic Catholic formulation, scriptural formulation, that that we should not be shy about speaking the truth. We should not compromise the truth. And again, we speak it though in charity. I think that this will be a sort of segue into his what we can expect him to talk about artificial intelligence and the importance of truth in undergirding how we approach this new world that we're entering. So again, I want to emphasize, just if we talk about what Pope Leo will be focusing on in the international arena, it will be peace, it will be justice, it will be truth, being a voice for those three pillars. And at the same time, a challenge to those who would oppose those central principles of a Catholic approach to international engagement. Finally, let me speak just a little bit before we go to questions about some specific issues as they might come up. And I think the first, let me talk about Ukraine. I think that one thing we've seen from Pope Leo already is direct speaking very directly to the war in Ukraine. He said on August 24th to President Zelensky, he said, Ukraine's future is Europe's future. And he spoke in particular about Ukraine's inclusive identity. He really speaks of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and I think it's interesting to see what his support will look like going forward. But I think we've seen very direct support so far. In Gaza, I think that we've seen as a second example of a critical issue on the world stage right now. Obviously, an appeal for peace constantly. And after the strike on the Holy Family Church in Gaza, Pope Leo spoke out directly. He called Prime Minister Netanyahu. He talks about the famine and the children of Gaza starving while the world watches. And so he's evolving from sort of more general appeals to something more specific. And I think that's something that it's very interesting to watch and we'll keep an eye on. And then finally, let's talk about the United States. Of course, with an American Pope, it's going to be so interesting to see how this evolves over the next years. I think that on the one hand, we know that there is a very much of a difference right now in many aspects of U.S. foreign policy and the Vatican approach to foreign policy. I take as one example, cuts in foreign aid, cuts to PEPFAR, about which Pope Leo has spoken out quite strongly. I think that the Vatican has spoken about the devastation caused by these cuts in aid, and I think that this tension will be there in the background for sure. Already, we know that Pope Leo has spoken out about the migration crisis that we're facing, and we know that he speaks all the time as a theme about encountering and listening to the poor. And then again, we talk about issues of democracy. I'll be interested to watch how that develops, right? I think that the focus we've seen so far is on emphasis on human dignity, emphasis on solidarity with those who are vulnerable, and again, an emphasis on speaking the truth. So we can expect those kinds of statements, those kinds of views to come from Pope Leo. We know that he will not. I believe that we can say that he will not be speaking directly, not sort of engaging in every conversation around issues here in America, but I think that he will stand up for Catholic teaching, again, around peace, around justice, around service to the poor, around care and protection for migrants. And that'll be both through his own witness and his own words, but also through support for bishops here in the United States, and for their actions. We know that, for instance, Pope Francis wrote a letter to U.S. bishops last February regarding the support for migrants that we are all called to offer. And I think it's fair to say, as someone who was the head of the dicastery for bishops, that it's likely that Pope Leo had a hand in that document. So I think we know from his personality, from his disposition, that he is not someone who is sort of aggressive and confrontational and out there to pick a fight. And yet we also know that he's someone that sticks up for his beliefs, stands up for Catholic teaching, and that we can expect him to be a moral voice on the world stage. So with that, I think I'll just wrap up, and close with one final sort of bit of information, which is that in a recent Gallup poll, Pope Leo ranked first in trustworthiness among world leaders, not just among Catholics, but among all respondents. Just a signal that that's why his voice matters on the world stage. He stands up for the voiceless. He sees universal dignity. And I think there's no doubt that he will influence international affairs. And with that, I'll be ready for questions. Oh, I think you're muted, Boy. Sorry.
Thank you, Kim. I think that was a splendid overview, and it really puts us in the picture and in the mode of thinking about this new Pope's role in the world. Uh, in your time in Rome, um, did you get to meet the future Pope Leo? What kind of encounters did you have? What kind of impression did you have?
So it's interesting. I would say that in my work here with U.S. bishops, in my work in Rome, that I know quite a few U.S. bishops. I have just over time have relationships with U.S. cardinals, U.S. bishops, and of course, Cardinal Prevost is an American. But the interesting thing is that he has been in Peru and then in Rome, and so not here in the United States. So no, I've met him sort of in passing at this synod, at this global gathering that we were both a part of, in different ways. And so I've shaken his hand, I've met him there, I've seen him in press conferences, etc. But I wouldn't say that I know him well, but I do know people who know him well, and have worked very closely with him. And one person I'll name, and she's spoken about it publicly, is Emil Kuda, who is the secretary of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America, which is another Vatican body that Cardinal Prevost was the head of. And Ilse is a Latin American theologian and a woman who worked closely with him. And I had lunch with her actually on the day that Pope Leo was elected, and we were talking about whether this was a possibility. Could it be that we would have an American pope, another pope who had served in Latin America? And I was struck by how hopeful she was, but also how strongly and supportively she spoke of Cardinal Prevost, and what a good person, effective behind the scenes leader he was.
I can imagine. Um, and one other, just in my impression, then we'll go to the questions. We have quite a few questions. Uh, his attitude and his predecessor's attitude on the issue of migration and deportation of migrants seems to be pretty strong. Does that suggest that he's going to wind up in some kind of a confrontation with the current leadership in the United States?
So I would say that I don't know if confrontation is the right word. I think it's fair, something we're seeing from U.S. bishops right now, and Catholic leaders generally, so leaders of Catholic ministries like Catholic Charities, Catholic educational organizations, higher education, and other groups, Catholic Relief Services, is that they've really been affected by, and their people have been affected by, whether it's cuts to USAID, in the case of Catholic Relief Services, whether it's the fear that's running through migrant communities here in the United States, and of course the deportation efforts and other assaults on human dignity. In those cases, you're seeing Catholic leaders here in the United States really find their voice. And I think that for the Vatican, for the Holy See, having Catholic leaders in country, right, respond to issues that take place within their country is always the first, sort of place to begin a conversation. I know that here in the United States, I could list many, many, many examples of bishops who are really finding their voice and standing in solidarity with those who are suffering, with migrants who are suffering. And at the same time, you'll see, while Rome will leave it in many senses, will look for leadership from bishops and other Catholic leaders within particular countries. I think it's fair to say that Vatican leaders and Pope Leo will find that moral voice and will speak up when it's opportune.
So keep your eye on the bishops, in other words.
Keep your eye on the bishops. And by the way, for sure, I want to be clear. I think Pope Leo will be a strong moral voice in support of migrants, in support of refugees. It's a constant priority in Rome, a central priority of Francis, and there's no doubt that in my mind that it'll be a central priority for Pope Leo as well. And the question is simply, to what extent do we use the bully pulpit of the papacy to speak about it, or sort of prudentially decide that the U.S. leaders are the ones to speak about it.
Uh, you mentioned Francis and Prevost being um, seemingly at odds at the beginning, but actually became very close collaborators.
Mhm.
Um, there's a question from a Zoom user, one of our viewers, on what issues were Francis and Prevost in disagreement?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. Well, you know what? I will talk about one issue where Cardinal Prevost said that he learned from Pope Francis, and that's the issues of LGBTQ welcome in the church. So when Pope Leo was elected, you know that the first thing that happens, right, is that everybody goes back and looks at every possible statement or tweet or anything else that Cardinal Prevost, Bishop Prevost, Father Prevost had ever written or said, to find something that might be worth highlighting, either in opposition to or in support of his election. And obviously all sorts of interesting things came up in that. We see videos of Pope Leo at the World Series. We see, in a sort of Chicago shirt, etc. We see all sorts of pictures of him from his young years. One thing, though, that surfaced was him speaking about LGBTQ issues in a way that I think today would not be seen as welcoming, and was sort of in traditional Catholic language, that was simply, again, things have changed so much over time in the way people speak and approach this issue. And he was just sort of repeating the kind of traditional language of the time, which was not too long ago. And Pope Leo said, Cardinal Prevost said, what I learned from Francis is that it's important to be welcoming. And what does welcome really look like? And it looks like seeing the person in front of you, seeing the face of the human person, and understanding that everybody has equal human dignity, and that our words can wound, and our way of talking about these issues is not, has to be one of welcome, and has to be one in which we learn and listen. And I think that is a place where Francis, through his very outspoken style, remember on his first papal press conference on the plane, said famously, "Who am I to judge?" Right? So very sort of tossed off a comment about how we have to be accepting, right, of people who are different from us. And I think over time, Leo learned that instead of his simple acceptance of teaching, without it's acceptance of teaching, of course, that's everybody's accepting teaching, but how do we act in a welcoming way? That's something he learned, and had a difference of opinion about originally.
You've mentioned his time in the third world, so-called third world, and his focus on it, and the church's focus on that. Robert Ruby asked the question: as the proportion of church members in Africa and other parts of the global South grows, will that demographic change alter the Vatican's authority among American Catholics? Will either liberals or socially conservative American Catholics feel estranged from Rome? Could that happen?
That's a great question. In other words, the church has for sure been growing in the global South, and that is not a new trend. That's something that's been ongoing. I think that and so that's one trend we've seen for a long time. A second trend that we've seen for a long time is changes in an understanding of church authority, right? We've gone from a church of pay, pray, and obey to a church in which, post-Vatican II church, in which we have a deeper understanding of conscience, and in which American Catholics don't or reflexively follow church teaching in a way that they might have in prior generations. So those are very complex trends that have been ongoing and have lots of causes, lots of drivers, let me say. So the question then, I'm not sure how to connect those to the question of will liberal or conservative American Catholics feel estranged from Rome? Because I think that's an ongoing process, those two trends. What I will say is that having an American Pope, I think, has been a force for unity among American Catholics. And I'll give you an example. Cardinal Cupich, who is the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, Illinois, a close advisor to Pope Francis and someone who knows Pope Leo very well as well, is not nobody's idea of a sentimentalist, nobody's idea of somebody who is very emotional, sort of in public, etc. And he was on an interview shortly after Pope Leo was elected with Lester Holt of NBC, and he was asked, what does it mean to have an American Pope? And Cardinal Cupich, and a Pope from Chicago, no less, of course, and Cardinal Cupich started to tear up, something I've never seen. And he said, he's one of us. He came from the same Catholic culture that we grew up in. And he started to tear up. And it's a remarkably evocative and affecting moment because what it says is that our church, which is, it's less on the world stage liberal, conservative, those terms don't apply so much as young. We are a young church in the context of the Catholic tradition going back to millennia. And so when we're in this sort of moment of a pope from our country, it's a way of saying that we have something to give to the world, right? And our form of Catholicism, the way we live it here, it has something to offer the world. But I want to be clear, it also means we have something to learn from global Catholicism as well. And I think in this moment, American Catholics have paused some of their our kind of back and forth over some contentious issues and are really taking a beat, and I hope it continues, of looking for places of unity.
Well, if he is not the bridge between American Catholics and the rest of the world, I don't know who could be. He definitely has that role. Um, we have some specific questions about his position on specific issues, but also on the church policy. Robbie Harris, the chairman of our board, wants to know about Israel Palestine. Has the Pope actually expressed a view on a Palestinian state?
Think that the Pope, so I want to be clear that what Pope Leo and what the Vatican, what the Holy See will always stand for is peace, right? And in this context, and in particular, has spoken out against right now has spoken against what's the famine that's going on and the particular approach, the bombing at the Church of the Holy Family, et cetera. So yes, the Vatican does. My understanding is that the Vatican is in support of a two-state solution, but right now is really in support of a ceasefire and of a resolution of the current conflict. That's what the focus is right now.
But it hasn't actually recognized a Palestinian state
I
as
don't
many
know.
states have.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
I don't believe so, but I'm not sure.
Stephen Shore has a question. You haven't mentioned ecumenism. Is there a connection between ecumenism and diplomacy.
Of course, I think that is an important dimension of Catholic teaching, and certainly in the post-Vatican II era. I think that in many places, I just met today with the Archbishop of Delhi, and who is an ecumenical leader. And of course, in India, there is so much. Lots of complicated interreligious issues, of course. But I want to say that in many places, um, Catholics have been in the lead in ecumenical dialogue, and that gives us the kind of training and the kind of experience that helps us engage in diplomatic efforts over time. And so, yes, there is a connection there, both in terms of training and experience, but also relationships as well, and the kind of relationships among civil society organizations that can help lead to successful diplomacy.
Where is the world stage from which Leo speaks, and who is hearing from him? Uh, um, are we hearing his thoughts on peace and immigration loudly enough for him to have an impact?
Mhm.
Of course, he does have the he does have the Holy See, which is a pretty good stage on the whole. But certainly for Catholics, I'm not sure. I think the question relates more to the non-Catholic world.
Hmm, that's really interesting. Here's a great question, right? How do we reach, what is the stage like for a leader of the Catholic Church? I want to point as an example of the kind of world leadership or stage that a pope might have. I want to point to Pope Francis's funeral and Pope Leo's election, and to say that it's hard to envision the kind of attention to a funeral of a world leader, a religious leader, a political leader, et cetera, and the election of the leader to follow that we saw for if in that moment over those months in the spring, right? In other words, there was world attention on these on what was happening at the time in Rome, in St. Peter's Square, in a way that you don't see for other kinds of leaders. And the question is, why is that? I think, first of all, it's the fact of, again, a 1.4 billion member world religion, right? And the sort of the fact that we are the largest network of networks, that we are present in every country, that we do have this tradition. There's no doubt about that. There's also, secondly, the kind of imagery that you see. I mean, it's just a remarkable story and picture that you see when you see the image of this institution that has lasted over time. So those things give the Pope a voice on the world stage. But ultimately, what it comes down to is moral leadership. And I think the reason that Pope Francis could often capture world conversation and also provide that kind of moral leadership is because he spoke so often for the voiceless and vulnerable in that distinctive Catholic key. So think about some images you might remember of Francis. And for instance, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there's an iconic image of Francis alone in St. Peter's Square in the rain, saying to the world, "Be not afraid." Right? There's an iconic image of Francis holding and hugging someone who was afflicted with boils. There's iconic images of Francis meeting migrants and children who were suffering. And I think it's those kinds of images that convey moral leadership that Francis really made great use of, and not intentionally, not in an instrumental way, but simply be living out the gospel. And the interesting thing will be, how does Pope Leo live out his role as a world leader? And I think that, obviously his main role is as a spiritual leader of 1.4 billion Catholics, and in living out our mission as servants of the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? That's his role. But in giving voice to, standing with the voiceless and vulnerable, loving our neighbors, seeking peace. There's no doubt that Pope Leo will have a different style than Francis. There's also no doubt that as the leader of the Catholic Church, he will have a place on that stage. Um, and I think we can envision that it'll be different, of course, from Francis. Some of it will be probably more behind the scenes, less spontaneous from what we know from Pope Leo's disposition, we've seen in the past. But we do know that he'll have that seat at the table.
And he may have the seat on all news television
Yeah.
as things develop, because there are platforms galore right now.
Mhm.
But that's the problem. There are too many platforms, and it's a total distraction, and it's hard to find the nuggets that really matter sometimes.
Well, and I think that's one of the ways in which a world leader, one of the ways in which the leader of the Catholic Church can break through all that noise is because, again, it's the advantage of having a higher. I mean, there were lots of challenges, right, with the kind of hierarchical structure that we have, but there are lots of advantages as well. And one is that we have one leader, and that our moral voice can be expressed through that one leader in situations where we're called to speak up for the vulnerable. He can be a focus that draws attention from our fragmented social media culture. And I hope that's something that he lives out.
This is from Carl Kilhofer, one of our trustees. Will Pope Leo possibly allow marital change for the marriage for the priesthood?
So I will point back to the Amazon Synod. We had a synod on the Amazon, which was again a global gathering where Pope Francis wanted to focus on the church in the Amazon region, and he brought leaders to Rome to focus on questions and challenges that people in that region were facing. And one of the issues that came up at the time was allowing what was called viri probati, so sort of a married man, a senior married man leader in the church, sort of being able to act in the role of a priest, right? It's in a way that is different from church teaching right now. This was sort of under consideration and discussion. And because the Amazon is so short of priests, that issue ultimately did not end up going anywhere, and I think that it's unlikely that we will see much change in that regard anytime soon. That's my view, but that's only my personal view of the matter. But I do know that what Pope Leo will do in discussing contentious issues or challenging issues or issues that are brought up in various parts of the world is approach it in a way that is one of listening and learning. And it's this synodal approach of not just dismissing things out of hand, but engaging with them and listening to people who are affected by them. I think that's something we can be confident about.
And here's a question in the same light from John Meyer. Will Pope Leo support the ordination of women deacons?
So I want to, I think the question of the diaconate is an interesting one as well, and kind of along the same lines. In the gathering that again, we're talking about something different from the priesthood, right? This is the diaconate. Women serve potentially serving as deacons. The question in the Catholic Church is that there is historical evidence that women served in this role. Some would say early in the early church, and that there is a tradition in this regard, and that it is something that could be revived. It's a very live conversation in the church in the wake of this synod on synodality that I talked about. And so the question is, how will the church approach it? It is, Lemmy, I hate to be too in the weeds, but in this global consultation, this synod on synodality, Pope Francis created 10 study groups to study some questions that needed further examination. One of those was on issues surrounding women in the diaconate and leadership roles, et cetera. And so that question is under consideration right now. It's been under consideration for a long time. And I think that we will hear more about it. And again, I think that what we can know about Pope Leo is that he's someone who will listen and will be sure that he's hearing all voices, and know that he also is someone who is in line with church tradition and understands that the church, as it approaches these questions, right, there are lots of different and competing there are lots of different and competing inputs to consider.
There is a Russian Catholic Church. There are, I believe, and there are other Catholic churches. Do you know anything about the history of the Russian Catholic Church?
Well, I would say this. There are all sorts of there are many different sort of there's the Roman Catholic rite, and there are many different rites in the church. I would say that for Leo in particular, what we do know is that he has been engaging with the Ukrainian Catholic Church already with Archbishop Shevchuk, and again has been speaking out there and has really I think made some significant statements in that regard. I don't know about any engagement of his with the Russian church.
Pope Leo is said to be the best traveled pope in history. what area or what in his travels do you think has made the biggest impression on him or the biggest impact on him?
I think being the head of a global religious order would probably be the way, sort of that is part of why he has traveled so widely, of course, because he's visited the Augustinians in countries around the world. But I want to say that it's that fat. It's not just traveling for travel's sake. Of course, this isn't just ceremonial travel. It is traveling to visit communities around the world, and that is part of the Augustinians' charism, that they live in community. That community is very important. That they are embedded within communities. And so, to my mind, when I think about Pope Leo's travels that helped form him for the role he is in right now, I want to say that his traveling as part of a community and visiting other communities of which he is a part, right, makes it a much deeper experience and makes it a more real experience, and one in which I would hazard to guess, learned a great deal about these countries in a way that you or I might not learn simply traveling to them, even regardless of how deep our understanding was or our learning was.
Is he the first pope who who came from an order?
No, Pope
I'm sorry, from heading an order.
Uh, I think, yeah. I mean, my certainly in the modern era, yes. Pope Francis was, of course, a Jesuit, and one of the elements of being part of a religious order that I think is so interesting is that it really is an exercise in religious orders engage in communal discernment to make decisions. Certainly, the Jesuits, the Augustinians, and so women religious as well, of course, and that understanding of how to come to a decision, how to resolve an issue communally in an exercise of real discernment. And I mean that, it's a very um, well established process that these orders go through. And I think that does a couple things. Number one, I think it prepares leaders for the papacy very well, being a part of an order, being a leader of an order, certainly. But secondly, in this current moment, I think not coming out of a diocesan structure, right? So not having been the bishop of a city in the United States, the cardinal archbishop of a major city here, for instance, means that there's a certain kind of freedom for someone who is stepping into the role of pope, that they're not tied and connected to sort of a particular political culture or a particular history within a country. I think that's one reason that, we heard before Pope Leo was elected that there would never be an American pope, right? That was kind of the word on the street. Well, they'll never elect an American. And I think one of the reasons he was elected, even though he is an American, is that he had so much experience around the world. He had been in Peru. He had immigrated from America to Peru, and really had that kind of experience that wasn't kind of caught up in internecine, American Catholic battles or political battles or anything like that.
I find that a really fascinating insight, the role of being the head of an order
Yeah.
and the travels that it required and the community experience it provided and the insight. It obviously is a different form of education than most of us have, and
Absolutely.
probably than most popes have.
Absolutely. It is a much different form and very experiential. I mean, I think that's what I'm always struck by is that leadership in the church, again, it's rooted. I want to be clear. We're talking about political issues and international engagement. And at the end of the day, Pope Leo is a spiritual leader who is charged with bringing the gospel to the world, the gospel of Jesus Christ, of loving your neighbor, of seeking peace, of building the communion of the church, and it's the kind of discernment and the kind of prayerful life, and the kind of solidarity with those in need that forms someone like that who has risen to pope that I think is critical to remember when we think of him in the context of world leadership.
What are examples you could cite of a pope influencing world affairs? I mean, obviously John Paul supported solidarity, and that came off pretty well. Um, but there may be examples, other examples we haven't thought of, and also examples where a pope has tried very hard and failed.
Sure. I mean, well, I think sort of the most iconic moment for me as someone who, my lifetime has Paul VI, John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Francis, and now Pope Leo in my lifetime. And as a young person, I remember just this iconic image of Pope John Paul II, right? I mean, to just hundreds of thousands of Polish people, and his presence on the world stage as sort of a globe-trotting world leader who helped defeat communism. That certainly was an iconic image for me growing up, and I think a moment certainly of world leadership for a pope that we can point to. I think that, but every pope I think has had examples of that, and I think for Francis, as I mentioned, I think a thawing of relations in Cuba. I think there's so much behind the scenes work that goes on. Just recently, for instance, when we talk about Ukraine and Russia and what the role of Vatican might play in that didn't go anywhere. But there's always this idea that Rome can play a role both diplomatically out in front or diplomatically behind the scenes. And I think that shouldn't be underestimated.
Is there a change in emphasis between Francis and Leo on Ukraine? I had the impression that Francis was listening a lot to the Russian envoy at the Vatican, and just maybe giving him a little bit too much time. Uh, I'm not sure that that's the case with Leo, but tell me if that impression is correct.
Sure. I guess what I want to say there is I don't know that I'd characterize Francis that way. I would say that Pope Francis always held the door open for peace. And in that regard, I think that and in every situation, and so I think his default mode was one of looking for any way that we might achieve peace and keeping the door open in that regard in ways that obviously that supporters of Ukraine sometimes felt were too open to Russia. I would say that Pope Leo, as I mentioned earlier, has been, I think, very direct and increasingly direct about the situation in Ukraine. And it'll be interesting. I don't think there's going to be a change in policy, but I think a change in emphasis, perhaps, and a change of wording. I think that we might see that. I think that we're starting to see a little bit of that. But again, I want to be clear. I think that for all popes, for all leaders of the church, peace is always the focus, and of course standing against aggression is a part and parcel of that, and I think we're seeing Pope Leo speak to that.
That brings me back to the role of the church, the Orthodox Church in Russia and in Ukraine.
Mm,
And the Orthodox Church in Russia has been a cheerleader for Putin's invasion, basically.
mm.
Um, is there any influence the Pope can have Pope Leo can have on that? Because obviously it's not the same branch of the church, but it's the church.
Sure. I mean, I think that's very complicated relationships there. And I know that those relationships are always important to any Catholic leader. So those kinds of relationships are important. It's an extremely complicated situation that I don't feel competent to speak to, except to say that, of course, Pope Leo will want to, again, seek peace in the region, and will use any lever that he can to do that.
How much emphasis do you think he's going to put on the Middle East? Christians have been victims and losers in many of the Arab countries, um, and they've had a difficult time, and so they've been persecuted in places. Of course, Christians brought the Crusades also to the Middle East, um, but I think Pope Francis was very interested in that. Do you think that Pope Leo will be? I heard a rumor somewhere that he was going to make a trip to Lebanon, in fact.
I believe that we have heard that he's going to make a trip to Lebanon. I know that he's going to Turkey soon, and that I believe there's efforts underway to make sure to see if he can stop in Lebanon on the way. Don't know if that's been finalized yet, but I've heard that as well in an informal way. I think that the Middle East again will be a center of Pope Leo's work and voice, in the sense that it has been for for popes in the modern era, right? I think that he has spoken out again, I think more strongly in recent months around what's going on in Gaza, and in particular the famine that's going on right now. And I think that it would not be a surprise to see him continue that voice. We know we have a very strong and well-respected leader in Cardinal Pizzaballa there, and I think that his voice has been well respected. And I know that whenever Pope has someone who they can rely on in a region, that helps build that relationship and build efforts for the Pope to engage strongly. So what that engagement looks like, I can't say, but I do think that any place that there is conflict going on, any place that there is war, famine, aggression, I think that's a place where the church wants to be speaking for peace.
So I have one final question, which is really a suggestion. The question is, has the Baltimore Council considered inviting the Holy Father to give a talk? Of course, that's a question for me. No, we haven't, but we will. And if he'll come, we'll roll out the red carpet. Uh, Kim, I can't thank you enough for coming on tonight. I think that it's been really enlightening, illuminating, and really just a great experience hearing your explanations of how things work and how they might happen. So thank you so
Thank you for
much.
having me. Thanks for having me, everyone.
So thanks to our audience, thanks to our viewers. We're really glad you could join us. And good night to everybody.